to this webinar series, the Friday webinar series that we do. We have been very lucky, very fortunate that the series is doing very well. We're already booked till end of February. So we are doing now extra whenever there's a more contemporary issue that comes up, we do on a weekday now. We did 2 days back, we did with Sanjeev Sanyal when he did the states. Next week, we are doing on the state of the rural economy, again, middle of the week. So, our welcoming you to our Friday webinar series. As you know, that we have started this series about 3 years back. We have done about it's unbelievable success that we have had with this. We were also very fortunate that when we started this series, we wanted to bring in the best minds from across the world. We were successful in doing it. So we have a blend of Indian speakers and foreign speakers. We have also done under the India's G20. We have been very fortunate to do new international economic order, climate, women empowerment. But other than this, we have also had the privilege of having 3 Nobel laureates come and speak on this Friday webinar series. The main issue that we tackle in this Friday webinar series is the contemporary issues. And we try to bring the best minds across the world on that topic. As you know, that fits in our agenda of the think tank. The think tank started in October 31 with the aim of providing research-based policy advice. For nearly 6 months now, there has been a raging debate on unemployment. We have had very varied contentions. CMI database has been giving us some story. Then manufacturing unemployment, Professor Golder has been sharing research with us on this webinar series itself about 2 months back. Professor Santosh Mehrotra has been also talking about this publishing and making presentations, which is a little different variant. Surjit Bhalla has also been, so Dr. Surjit Bhalla is our advisor to EGROW, has also been writing on it. Professor Kingshuk has also been contributing in this debate. So what we have done starting today, we are going to have 3 consecutive Fridays discussion on this issue. Today we have Professor Santosh Mehrotra and the discussant is Professor Kingshuk Sarkar. Next week we are having Dr. Surjit Bhalla. Discussant will be most probably Professor Golder. If we can get him, there's a parallel presentation in which Professor Golder may be busy. So we are trying to get him. And week after we have Mr. Mahesh Vyas, who will be talking to us on CMI data. There's a new issue that has come up, jobs and skills related to this. We are going to have a presentation from Ruchir Agarwal on jobs and skills sometimes in January, and Professor Amit from Asim Premji again in January. So we want to tackle this issue and understand it clearly as to what is it that is happening in the country on employment. So let me introduce today's main speaker, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, a dear friend. He's a visiting professor, Center for Development Studies, University of Bath, UK, and former professor economics and chair of the Center for Informal Sector and Labor, JNU. He has spent 15 years with the UN in research positions, heading UNICEF's Global Research Program on Social Economic Policy at the Research Center in Florence, I think Innocenti Research Center in Florence.
That's right.
And as chief economist of the Global Human Development Report, New York. He returned to India to head the Rural Development Division and Development Policy Division of Planning Commission. He was also the Director General of the National Institute of Labour Economic Research Planning Commission in the rank of Secretary to the Government of India. He advises the current NITI, the Ministry of Labour, the Ministry of Skill Development. He is the lead author of several chapters of the 11th and 12th five-year plans of India and the India Human Development Report. He has a huge number of publications in reputed Indian and foreign journals. He regularly writes on labor issues in various newspaper columns, and his writings have been translated into Hindi, Spanish, French, Russian, German, and Portuguese. The discussion for today is Professor Kingshuk Sarkar, again a dear friend. He is an associate professor and area chair, General Management and Economics at the Goa Institute of Management, Goa. Prior to that, he had worked for Government of West Bengal as a labor administrator for over 2 decades. He has also worked in other premier institutions like V.V. Green National Labour Institute, National Institute of Rural Development, and Department of Economics, Jamia Millia Islamia. His areas of interest are plantation economics, labor economics, industrial relations, law and economics, labor administration, informal sector labor. He also has a number of publications in reputed journals and newspapers. He has attended and conducted numerous conferences, workshops, and seminars, and carried out important research assignments in both India and abroad. With this, I would like to invite Professor Mehrotra to go in details because he's the first one in the series. Of course, Professor Boulder has made presentation in the past, and to some extent Professor Bhalla also. But we are starting the series now, and in these 5 lectures, we would like to address this issue far more carefully. So I would request Professor Mehrotra to go in details, and then I'm going to invite Professor Kingshuk Sarkar. Professor Mehrotra, you could easily take 45-50 minutes.
Thank you.
I've seen your PPT, it is beautiful PPTs. So please go ahead. We are looking forward to your thoughts.
So, first of all, thank you very much for giving me a very generous introduction, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me and starting your employment series off. So I'm going to just share my presentation. And Vivek is standing by, and here we are. And I want to share my presentation. So Vivek, just watch out. Here we are. Okay, can you see this? Can you see this?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it is visible.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So that's the title of my presentation, India's Employment Challenge and a Way Forward. So it's in 2 parts, and you will see that I'm going to first talk about the challenge and then go on to the way forward, because very often people complain that you just sort of cannot tell us about the problem. We're looking for a way out. We are at a very critical juncture, and I will therefore start. Yeah, here we are. So that's the facts and figures part, which is, I'll begin with what the official narrative pre and post 2019 has been, and then I'll spell out the reality as it emerges from the government's own data, and how many this is one contentious issue as to how many non-farm jobs does India really need to create on an annual basis. I'll discuss that, and then I discussed this question as why the last decade has been a lost decade in a rapidly aging workforce, and then tell the real wages story, which is, I believe, the real story, because this is another contentious issue. Before this part will take me about 25 to 30 minutes, and then in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'll talk about the components of an industrial policy, which I believe is the appropriate way forward. Why do I think an industrial policy is needed? For many reasons in the Indian context, but not least because 100 countries after 2008, after the global economic crisis, adopted an industrial policy, a manufacturing strategy. And I strongly believe that this would offset the emerging risks of India entering into a middle income trap. You all probably know that we are a LMIC, a low middle income country at $2,800 per capita. The upper middle income level begins only at 4,000, and the high income level begins at just over 14,000. So what we need, I argue, is an inclusive growth strategy for 8% growth per annum for at least 2 decades if we are going to create the jobs. And that's the way forward for an inclusive growth strategy, and also sustaining 8% growth if we are to come anywhere close to becoming Viksit Bharat. So that's a plan. Let's begin with the official view of joblessness. But before I do that, let me just tell you that what I'm speaking to you today about is straight out of a new book I'm sending to Bloomsbury, London, in literally 10 days or so. It's in a very advanced stage, and they commissioned me, and it's called India Out of Work. Anyway, so it will be out in the early part of the year. India Out of Work. Okay, moving on. So there are several elements. This is an element in the official view of joblessness. One is that they tend to trash CMI data. So I know that CMI has issues, but let's not forget that it has a larger sample size than the national survey organizations, the NSOs, PLFS. The CMI covers organized and unorganized sectors. It covers both the rural and the urban, and it's done on a continuous basis. It generates panel data. And very importantly, something I'll come back to, it uses compliant, ILO compliant or internationally compliant definitions, with regrettably, unfortunately, the PLFS has not been using. It's a subject I'll come back to. I was a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics of MOSPI in the NSO for 3 years, like Goldar, like Pranab Sen, and 2020, 21, 22, and we kept making that case. And if anyone's interested, I can come back to that. So they tend to trash that, but I mean, we'll have chance to discuss, as Dr. Charan Singh just mentioned later on. Then another official view is that PLFS is not comparable to the employment-unemployment round of 2011 and 12. You probably know that we've had 5-yearly labor force surveys up until 2017-18. And prior to the 17-18, when the PLFS started, the EUS, the employment-unemployment round by the NSO, was the last one, which was quinquennial, meaning. So there are people in the Niti Aayog who argue that you shouldn't be comparing 2017 to 2011-12. Well, the fact of the matter is the NSO's annual report of 17-18 itself compares the 17-18 PLFS to the earlier rounds. So I don't see why they are not comparable if the NSO itself has got it wrong. Next. You see, this is another thing that has been argued from an official point of view, that COVID actually didn't make much of a difference to the job situation. And the elements of that argument go as follows from an official point of view. They go as follows. That if you look at data in the PLFS, after, now you have to understand the background of this. 17-18 PLFS, please appreciate the 2017-18, which was the first periodic labor force survey, actually was the year coming immediately after the demonetization and the GST, when the country had the highest open unemployment in a 45-year history. And its LFPR had been labor force participation, which is the share of the working age population which is looking for work. And the WPR is the share of the working age population which has work. Now, obviously, it's a good thing if unemployment is falling and the LFPR and WPR is rising. That's what the claim is from 2020 onwards, which was the first year of COVID, in which year you will recall the economy had gone into contraction. And since then, it's argued that, the unemployment rate has been falling and LFPR and WPR is rising, which is completely counterintuitive, because if the economy had gone into contraction, then how come unemployment was falling and the LFPR and WPR has been rising? Because this completely ignores, this claim ignores that while the PLFS seems to suggest that LFPR and WPR are rising and the unemployment rate is falling, the fact of the matter is this rise in participation and is actually on account of unpaid family labor, a subject I'll come back to. It's also accompanied by rising informality, and it's accompanied by falling regular employment. And worst of all, a subject I'll come back to, it's accompanied over the last 4 years with agricultural employment growing, which is the opposite of what you need to see or want to see in a developing country, because a developing country which wants to become developed, or at least upper middle income, needs to reduce the share of agriculture in total employment. Because what's the current situation? Current situation is that the PLFS is itself showing that in 2018-19, agriculture's share in total employment, well, in 2017-18, it was 42%. But after that, when COVID began, the PLFS shows that it rose to 45%, from 42 to 45. The absolute number of workers in agriculture rose. In fact, so all of this I will demonstrate. This is the opposite of what you want to see happen. And worse still, when people go back from urban areas and work from urban areas, they're actually engaged in unpaid family labor. Now, ILO doesn't regard unpaid family labor, which I will from henceforth call UFL, as employment at all. It calls it work. But you see, the point is that that's what's causing the WPR and LFPR to fall. And if you eliminate that, suddenly it disappears. And this is exactly what CMI data is showing. And CMI doesn't regard unpaid family labor as employment. It regards it as work, like the ILO does, like internationally compliant definitions do. But PLFS continues to do its own. Similarly, I mean, at a time of COVID, when we know that unemployment rose and rose very sharply, the PLFS is showing unemployment is rising. I mean, look, we know that in 2012, the total unemployed in the economy, when there were about 470 million workers, the total unemployed was 10 million. And that shot up in 2017-18 or 19 to 30 million, a tripling in a matter of 6-7 years, as I'll demonstrate. And even in 22-23, very recently, 28 million people were added to the unemployed. And worse still, the youth unemployment rate is still double. Now it's still double. And they're not in education and employment and training. Numbers of youth are also double. They actually doubled, as I will show to you. And these are youth who are not in education, not in employment, not in training. In other words, they're just literally hanging around. In other words, they're not even in agriculture. That's the point I'm making. And these numbers are still double those you found in 2012. Moving on. So in other words, the official view completely ignores all this thing. Moving on very quickly. Then the claim is, of course, made that, oh, after recovery, GDP could not have returned to pre-COVID 2020 levels without employment having recovered. Well, my response to that is GDP can recover due to the organized sector recovering, as did happen in the last 4 years, without the unorganized sector recovering. And the MSMEs data that was recently released, literally recently, which is the NSO data, it's called the Annual Survey of Unorganized Sector Enterprises, all non-farm employment, shows there was a shocking reduction in the number of enterprises and the number of workers in the unorganized sector after the 2016 period. And so under the circumstances, you may have a recovery, but the unorganized sector is not recovered, even though the organized sector is recovered. Because it's not a V-shaped recovery post-COVID. It's a K-shaped recovery. Another argument that's often made in the official view is that the Employees Provident Fund Organization, which registers all workers who are supposedly formal workers and units or enterprises which employ at least 20 workers, the data that is collected by the government, new registrations are rising. So the argument is made that jobs are rising. Now, my response to that is, but formality may rise, meaning erstwhile informal workers may be becoming now formal, because earlier if a firm had 19 workers and now EPFO requires that all firms that have 20 workers, that firm adds 1 worker, suddenly employment has risen by 20. But actually it's not employment. Employment has risen by literally 1, from 19 contract workers to 1, and they are all now registered in the EPFO. But these are not new jobs. They're simply an improvement in the formality situation. I mean, even formality may not have risen because the EPFO constantly is revising down, revising up at the end of the year. But yet this argument just goes on being made repeatedly. A final sort of argument that's made is, oh, and I sort of have heard it often enough from government spokesmen, unemployment existed before. So why did earlier governments before 2014 not solve it? Okay, fair enough. But the point is, as I said, unemployment has tripled and youth unemployment had tripled. What about that? There are real issues. Finally, there is a myth. India does not have really unemployment, but actually, and I quote from a recent article, too many people stuck in low productivity, informal jobs, not in jobs what they aspire to. Fair enough. This is also true that 90% of our workers, the 570 million workers we have in 22-23, 90% of them are informal. That means they have no social security. If anyone's interested, I can come back to that. It's true that that's the case. However, as I've already just demonstrated to you, unemployment has risen. So, I mean, it's true that we've always had people in low productivity informal jobs. This was certainly a situation prevalent till 2012 and even earlier. But this is only partly frictional unemployment. This is still true and massively so, I agree with you. But the fact of the matter is, as I just said, unemployment rate has increased. And I'll come back to that. And it's increased very sharply in the last 10 years. It had increased by 18 itself from 2% to 6.1, and youth unemployment had gone from 6 to 18. I'll show all this for entire population, especially the young. Anyway, now the most recent version of the government view is the India Clems report. And this is arguing that employment essentially grew so sharply in the period from 2021 to 22-23, 3 years of COVID, which is precisely the period, as I'm saying, when the economy had gone into contraction, twice as large a contraction as the global economy. Global economy contracted by 3.1%, the Indian economy contracted by 5.8%. And the State Bank chief economist has been spreading this. Now, what are the questions around the Clems report? And by the way, Clems is financed by the RBI. It's not done by the RBI because the RBI doesn't collect any data. Anyway, the logical question is about the Clems claim that, oh, and the PM in Parliament said, and even outside, that India has created 8 crores jobs in the last 4 years, recently. Now, 8 crores means 80 million. And we were all stunned, and it was done on the basis of Clems. And the point is, 60 million of those workers were added to agriculture in the last 3 years, ladies and gentlemen. A subject I will come back to, which is the opposite of what you want to see. As I said, agriculture share went from 42% to 46%. In a developing economy, you don't want that to happen. In fact, this was a reversal of a process that had been going on since the first year, for the first time after independence. From 2004 onwards, the absolute number of workers in agriculture began to fall. For 15 years, they were falling till 2019. And then that reversal is so severe that 60 million workers get added to agriculture, subject I come back to. So anyway, when this claim was made about 8 crore new jobs in the last 4 years, many of us asked how employment could grow in India when the ILO was saying that in East Asia, Southeast Asia, employment had stagnated, and in the rest of the world too it had stagnated. It's just simply illogical. And besides, in the period between pre-COVID PLFS, the total number of workers was it was 54 crores, and in 23 it was 57 crores. That's only 3 crores, and that 3 crores also I've explained with unpaid family labor. So where do you get 8 crores from? Next, I have already said this, RBI collects no data, it's funds research, and we both Clems and PLFS use, both Clems and I use PLFS in our analysis. So it's simply illogical. The reason why they're coming up with an 8 crore number, as Dr. Ramkumar of Tata Institute and Dr. Mohanan, formerly a member of the Statistical Commission, in fact, the acting chair of the Statistical Commission, who has argued in a piece with Ramkumar that this 8 crore number in Clems has arisen because they're using an inflated population number, the national population. In other words, they're using the wrong multiplier. I could explain that, but in the interest of time, I won't go there. The other thing is that Clems ignores PLFS, shows the employment structure is changing. In what way? This is not something I've said very much about. Structural change was underway in a big way since 2003, all the way until 2019. It's now been reversed in the wrong direction after 2013. What we call the Arthur-Lewisian transition is being reversed because, as I will demonstrate, claimed. You see, this 8 crore estimate is, of course, first is one success that's claimed. Then the other success that's being claimed is that in our country, female labor force participation has been falling for a long time. But this is happening, the Clems claims, because now LFPR is rising. But it's rising in agriculture. I've just been saying that agriculture is already beset with surplus labor. I mean, it had 200 million workers, agriculture had in 2019. In 3.5 years, that shot up by 60 million. That's how the share of agriculture went up to 46 million. That's the opposite, as I was just saying. Moving on. So the increase in agricultural workforce is seen by Clems and even the government as a rise in employment. What's in fact happening is that rural women in agriculture, their numbers rise, rural women in self-employment rises, and self-employment consists of unpaid family labor and own account, and and so on. And these are the worst forms, and a reversal of women leaving agriculture began to happen since 2004. You see, women were leaving agriculture, which is a good development because girls were going to school. This process has been reversed. But unfortunately, most recently that is, but unfortunately the government economists see this as a positive. How can it be a positive? Because it's being driven many ways by unpaid family labor. You see, unpaid family labor in agriculture and also in urban areas was actually falling between 2004 and 12 when the economy was growing at nearly 8% per annum. It was falling, and unfortunately it has risen. So clearly, with an increase in rural areas in unpaid family labor from 55 million in 2019 to 95 million in 23, that's an increase of solid 40 million in unpaid family labor alone. Quite apart from the fact that of the 8 crore new jobs supposedly, 6 crore are in agriculture. Now, so the defense comes, especially from Professor Goldar, who was just mentioned, and this is also an official view, that the rise in female LFPR in rural areas is due to new animal husbandry and livestock production. But what is its share? The fact of the matter is girls have been enrolling in secondary rapidly, and they have no desire to be minding cattle and cows. Now here, look at the truth here in the next slide. Women in rural agriculture and allied sectors. This is the blue bar is 2005, the orange bar is 2012, and the gray bar is showing 2023. Now notice what is happening. Between 2005 and 12, look at the first set of bars in the histogram. You're growing of non-perennial crops. It's still below, 71. 71 is the share of women in agriculture doing non-perennial crops. It's slightly risen from 12 to 23 in the 12-year period, but it's still 20 percentage points lower than it was in 2005. Then growing up perennial crops. So if you look at 2023, 71 plus next the next growing of perennial crops is 76% is in crops. And annual production has risen. That's the fourth set of bars. True, yes. But it's not very large. It's only 23%. It's gone up from 10 to 23. What about the vast majority? So anyway, I think, I've established my point. I'm going to move on. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this view because this is a very specific Surjit Bhalla view that the UPA period did worse than the NDA 99 to 2004, and also the UPA did worse on jobs than the 2014 to 2024 record. I can demolish this very easily. To some extent, I've already been doing so, but I want you to just focus on this bold bullet. The fact of the matter is the economy over 2004 to 14 was growing at 7.8% per annum. Over the last 10 years, it's been growing at 5.8% per annum. And in the Atal period, 99 to 2004, So over the 12-year period from 2000 to 2012, we were generating as an economy 7.5 million new non-farm jobs. But that number of non-farm job creation has plummeted significantly. And I'm highlighting this for your benefit to suggest that if we grow faster than we have been doing, then India can generate 7.5 million jobs, at least have done it in the past, but it requires growing at least 8% per annum. Moving on, in the interest of time, moving on very rapidly. Also, it doesn't recognize this claim of Dr. Bhalla that one of the reasons why UPA jobs appear to be, UPA, in the UPA period, we're seeing less job creation, so-called, is because millions of young girls were enrolling in school. And that record is extremely high during that entire period. So the point here I'm making is that in the period from 2004 to 12, non-farm job creation was happening at the rate of 7.5 million, and it had already begun, that process had begun in the year 2000. And farm jobs were falling for the first time in India's history. That's called structural change. And because of that, the labor market tightens, wages rise, poverty falls, as demonstrated by consumption expenditure. I'm going to move on. Anyway, and I've already said unemployment had risen. So I'm now going to just, very rapidly show to you something else, which is very recently released data. Please notice that, I'm focusing on the facts and figures so that, I well establish my point. One recent narrative of the government is that although unorganized sector jobs might have fallen, the fact of the matter is that COVID recovery has ensured everything is hunky-dory. Well, is it? I'd like you to look at these 4 columns here. The first column is showing, all these are showing data from the annual survey. Sorry, it's called the annual survey now. It wasn't annual. It used to be every 5 years, and that's the time interval you're seeing, 2010, 11 to 2015, 16. It used to be every 5 years. Then it was finally, very recently, 3-4 weeks back, the ASUS was done, the annual survey of unorganized sector. For 21-22, that date, it was of course done in 21-22. It's been released. It's been released along with 22-23. Now, it gives you data for the number of establishments or unit enterprises. And notice what was happening. Notice what was happening between 2012 and 2015-16, which is that the numbers of establishments in millions had risen from nearly 57.7 to 63.4. That means establishments were rising all the time. And in 21-22, you're seeing the number of establishments has collapsed. And this is 21-22. That means we are still only in the early part of COVID, which means that there was a lingering impact of the demonetization, the GST being introduced suddenly, a poorly planned, which caused a slowdown in the economy. And that was the reason why, as I mentioned earlier, unorganized sector was suffering. Yes, there is recovery in 22-23, but look at the number of enterprises, it's only 65.4. In other words, in a full 8-year period, you've just gone from 2 million from 63.4 to 65.4. But you were growing so much more rapidly between 2010 and 15. Similarly, if you look at how you were growing number of workers, you had a 3 million increase over that 5-year period. You have a decline over a 7-year period from 15-16 to 22-3 to 109. That means there is a massive impact. And worst of all, and look, I've sort of made these numbers bigger, hired establishments, establishments where there are hired workers as opposed to own account enterprises, there, that percentage also shows a fall from 2015-16 to 22-23. That means the unorganized sector, even till now, has not really recovered. Moving on. Rapidly, I want to move on. Why was there a job slowdown? Well, the economic slowdown post-2016 was policy-induced. What are the policies? Demon, then a poorly designed and a badly implemented GST, where it was implemented. It's a good tax, but it was implemented so badly that if you ask, small enterprises, they will complain endlessly and very bitterly. I could explain that in the question and answer, but more importantly, the fact is, this was followed by a national lockdown in March of 2020 when the COVID came, when there were only 600 cases. It was the strictest lockdown in the history, in that period for any country. The Oxford University Blavatnik School of Government was doing a metric of how strict were national lockdowns during COVID. Ours came not just at 4 hours notice. It also was national in scope and extremely strict. It was at the top of the global league table. Can you believe it? So obviously the following growth drivers were impacted, as I will demonstrate, and it was deep enough to initiate a reversal of structural change, as I will show to you soon, very shortly, as to what happened. It's not just that agriculture share increased, agriculture number of workers increased, manufacturing suffered. See, the first driver of growth is private final consumption. It fell first. It has recovered, but it's barely recovered, a little bit above, in real terms, above the pre-2020 level. And the result is, it has cut household savings. It went down from 24% to 17% of GDP initially. It has risen slightly recently, but at the cost of retail debts rising. Private consumption of the upper classes, middle classes, that's still growing. Non-farm job growth has slowed. It's much slower than needed, as I will demonstrate. And as I just demonstrated, unorganized sector has barely recovered. A K-shaped recovery has taken place. So why are we surprised if the GDP grows at 8%, but consumption grows at only 4%? This is what's happened. And that's a driver of GDP growth. That's why you get 5.8% growth over a 10-year period, as opposed to 7.8. Next, gross fixed capital formation. That's the second driver. Now, let's look at the numbers here. What do the numbers tell us over a 10-year period? It's never risen a bit above 31%. It's been in the range of 26 to 31%. In 24, it has just climbed above this 31% number. By contrast, over the period when we were growing at 7.8%, it means 2004 to 14, it never fell below 31%. The investment to GDP ratio, it was 31 to 38%. And the recent increase in public investment in infrastructure, etc., very good. I could discuss that with you. But public investment is a small fraction of total investment to GDP. It can't compensate for private investment having fallen, and capacity utilization in the private sector has remained around or less than 75% in most sectors. So private investment is not rising. That's the second driver which is not growing. And why should we be surprised if jobs are not growing, that the consumption demand is not there, then the animal spirits of the capitalists are not thriving. And of course, the MSMEs have suffered and their investment is not taken. What happened? What about exports? Yes, it's true that in recent years, the IT exports, the services exports have done the nation a great favor. But you know what happened with goods exports? Goods exports were growing at around 15% for a 25-year period from 92 to to 2013-14. Over that period, the export to GDP ratio rose from about 10% to 25% over 91 to 2008. That 25% export to GDP makes India comparable to China. And the government, when this government came to power, merchandise exports were $318 billion. Surprisingly, for the next 4 or 5 years, the merchandise exports have been lower. It's a saving grace that services exports has offset this fall, but there are limits to services exports with deglobalization taking place in the world. Anyway, I mean, I'll say more about this if you're interested later. And finally, there's a fourth driver, of course, of growth, which is government expenditure, government investment. Now, can the government actually increase government investment on infrastructure or raise revenue expenditure? Where is the fiscal space? Because the debt to GDP ratio, which is running below 60% until 2019, has shot up first to 92%, now it's dropped to about 82%. So the debt to GDP ratio is particularly high. Now, I'll say one word because I know you'll all be wondering, well, public infrastructure, investment of the government is increased. Well, the reality, let me say in just 2 sentences, is the following. That if the fisc is compressed and the government is central government is in compression mode, and historically central government does not do accounts for only 1/3 of total government investment in infrastructure, etc. The remaining 2/3 is accounted for by state governments. Then the only reason why it appears that the government's infrastructure investment is increasing is because government investment is increasing is because the public sector enterprises, which also used to invest, their surpluses are all being taken up by the Ministry of Finance, and that's adding to the central government's investment. But that means the public sector enterprises are not investing. That's true, and that's the reality. So net, in fact, you don't have a very significant increase in the proportion of GDP. I'm going to move on very rapidly because this is something that you would have heard a great deal about, that India has become the fastest growing large economy recently. True. But most people don't seem to know that we've been the second fastest growing large economy for about 20 years. We become the fastest growing large economy only in the last 2-3 years because China's growth rate has fallen. And what has driven this? What has driven this is what is described as the new economy. And that new economy accounts for about 15%, and that's central to growth. And HSBC, Morgan Stanley, all these people have been telling us that this is what's happening as is Standard & Poor. Now, what's the reality? Let's go further. Oops. This 15%, which is the new economy in India, that has emerged. True, where 2 high-tech goods and services. One is mobile handsets, pharma, auto, and IT services. And it's true that India is gaining global market share since 2017. The next is IT services of 2 types have risen. First, that India is no longer just a giant call center as it was in the 1990s, nor a software services provider as it was in the 2000s. It's now selling accounting, legal, and R&D services, and India is a hub of global capability centers. There are apparently now 1,200 in the country, and they're delivering services for multinationals. The other thing, of course, is the second high-tech services sector, which is tech startups have plugged into the digital public infrastructure, which is India Stack. And they have, we've been seeing a spread of new firms, startups, which are doing fintech, e-commerce, edtech, logistics, and much foreign capital has promoted startups. But the fact of the matter is, despite all this, these same the Morgan Stanleys and S&P, etc., note that the GDP on account of the new economy expands only by 6.5% over the next, is likely to expand only by 6.5% over the next decade, which is higher than the 6% pre-COVID. But that means that 6.5% GDP doubles in 11 years to 7.5 from its current level of 3.8. And by the way, no international agency, World Bank, IMF, OECD, no international agency is projecting a higher growth than 6.5. But is that enough? And they themselves admit this. The HSBCs, Morgan Stanleys, and S&P, that they admit that it's not enough to create the 70 million jobs that we need over the next decade. But we need actually many more than 70 million, as I will show in a minute. It generates, they themselves say, and I'm quoting them, who generate only 1/3 of jobs needed. And that's because old India, as opposed to the new India, is 85% of the economy. So the hope is that, the new Indian economy would energize the old Indian economy, old India economy. But this actually loses sight of a foundational fact that many economists miss about the structure of non-farm enterprises in India, which is, as I will show in the next table, there are 66 million MSMEs in India, total. But 70% of those 66 million MSMEs are unregistered. Unregistered means the government doesn't know. The government doesn't even know about their existence. So how are they going to reach out to them? I have a whole paper on this subject in the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, roughly a year ago. You're welcome to look at it. Now, I'm going to rapidly move to tell you that all this amounts to a near crisis. Why is it a crisis? Let me focus on the demographic dividend. What's the demographic dividend? The dividend is defined as that period in the life of a nation, which comes but once, in which the share of the working age population is rising. Look at the middle of this graph. You've got data from 2011, and what do you see here? That the 15 to 59-year-old working age group, which is the NSS working age period, the absolute number of those in the working age rises till 2041. How far away is 2041? Precisely 15 years, 16 years, 15 years. It then begins to fall. What is the implication? The implication, ladies and gentlemen, is the dividend is ending. Like in China, it has ended. In Brazil, it has ended. In South Africa, it has ended. These are all, however, upper middle income countries. They are in the range of $6,500 to $12,000 per capita. We are at 2,800. And yet, we are just 15 years away from our dividend ending, which means we have to grow really fast, very, consistently over the next 20 years, as I will proceed to demonstrate to you now. We risk, forgive me, we risk losing our dividend. And I don't think I'm going to spend time explaining to you why the dividend is called a dividend, because if after the dividend is over, we become an aging society. China has become an aging society, which comes with its own problems, and their growth rate has fallen as you become an aging society. We have to grow fast, and we have only this window left. Chinese leaders have been saying for a decade since their window closed, meaning dividend ended. Europe became old after they became rich. We have become old without becoming rich. And China and India started the same level of per capita income, but China has a per capita income in PPP terms, at least, PPP terms, four times ours. Their total GDP is 2.5 times ours, although having started the same level in 95. Now, this is very central what I'm about to say in this slide, because it completely contradicts what other people are claiming, because they don't realize that the dividend is ending. Because there are 4 groups who need jobs, and each of these groups is a looming crisis. The first consists of a flow each year, 15 to 29-year-olds, and 6 million of these are entering the labor force. In other words, the enrollment is rising at every level of our education system. I can explain that to you in the question and answer, how rapidly over the last 20 years enrollment at school level and higher education has grown. And every year, 1.5 million engineers graduate, and 8.5 million graduate in other subjects, BCom, BSc, BBA, etc. That means very clearly that 10 million are 8.5 plus 1.5. These are people who are graduating. They may or may not all look for work, but there are 10 million graduating. It tells you something. This is a flow. Next. Significant share of this is girls, because girls achieved universal elementary education, then universal secondary, and their enrollment has risen in higher education. And yet their LFPR has been dropping, while enrollment has been rising. And these girls don't want to marry until 25, as I will demonstrate if you're interested from a Nandi Foundation. So that means they want to work. So we've got to accommodate these. One. Next, there is the stock of farm landless and small marginal farmers. We already had too many people in farming. 200 million in 2019 were producing 15% of GDP. Now that number has gone to 260 million in 22-23, and I saw the 23-24 PLFS, and that number is increased again. So we have to take this number back to 200 million, which would reduce the share of agriculture to 30% from its current 45%. And all these people want non-farm jobs, because all these people are young people who've gotten educated and they want to get the hell out of agriculture. That's a stock we have to account for. Next. Then there's the stock of unemployed. I've already spoken about that. I won't go any further. Fourth are the youth who are not in education, employment, or training, meaning this is in addition to those who are actually looking for work. That's number one. And believe it or not, the number here is 100 million. They need to be employed. The number rose from 51 million in 2012 to 100 million. I mean, that's a shocking doubling who need to be employed. And yet, on the 10th of September, I was debating this subject with Professor Bhalla, and he was claiming that no more than 7 million new jobs are needed at 60% LFPR to preserve the status quo on unemployment, and increase above 7 million will reduce unemployment. Well, the point is that we are estimating that, and he claims this because there's, the total fertility rate has dropped, so fewer people in the workforce. Well, my question to him was, really? The fact of the matter is TFR dropping means fewer babies are being born. It doesn't mean that the babies who were born earlier are not entering the labor force, as I've demonstrated in numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 above. Therefore, my estimate is, or our estimate is, that we should be adding non-farm jobs. Non-farm jobs, not because the government's narrative is, oh, agriculture is fine. Jobs in agriculture is fine. I'm saying that's not what the educated young want. And the vast majority, even the landless or the small marginal, poorly skilled, they want jobs in construction, not in farming. And the girls certainly don't want to be in animal husbandry. So we estimate there are at least 10 to 11 million per year new jobs that are moving on rapidly. This is already spoken about, so I'm going to be very brief here. This is youth open unemployment. for 2012, the first bar. The gray bar is the second bar in 18-19, and the third bar is 22-23. And just look at graduates. It used to be 20%. It shot up to 37% according to PLFS, and already in 2018-19. That's exactly the point I was making about 2017-18, 18-19 being very similar, because 45-year high. And then it has dropped to, let us say for graduates to 29%. But I said many of these educated are saying that we are working, but actually they are working in agriculture. I can show this. I mean, I have the data, I don't have the time. And the case of young women with education is even worse. You can see the graduate girls in a 10-year period, their open unemployment rate used to be 25%, it's 36% in 23. I'm going to move on very rapidly. Look at this. I was talking about 100 million, over 100 million NEET population. This is youth. In 17-18, that is 51 million. It had in 18-19, it was 122. It has come down a little bit because they're showing we are in agriculture. That's not employment. They don't want to be in employment. I'm moving on. The result of all this is that real wages, because non-farm jobs are not growing, have stagnated. So I'll move through this very fast, and you can see this for regular salaried and for casual labor. And then you will see this for this one was for real wages rural India from 2004 to 22. This is real wages for urban India, flat. It's flat, although it was rising and rising sharply from 4.5 to 11.12. Why was it rising? Because non-farm jobs were growing. And the same thing, look at this. Extreme left, 4.5 to 11.12. Real wages were rising. Real wages were rising. They've since then been flat. Agriculture, same story after 17-18. Although it was still, they were rising until 17-18. It's been flat. Manufacturing, flat. Non-manufacturing, construction, rising till 17-18. In the case of casual labor, but and then flat or tending to fall. Services, again, was rising early on in the first decade, flat. And this shows, of course, how low the wages are. Those who earn less than 100 rupees, extreme left 4 columns, self-employed, regulars, etc. Those under 200 rupees, 100 to 200, next 200 to 300. So basically, below 300 wages, daily basis, you've got as much as 52%. Moving on very rapidly. I mean, look, our unorganized sector real wages have also stagnated. I don't have the time to go into this. I'm going to move on. In order to save on time, I want to move on to the components of a manufacturing strategy as a way forward for India. And I really will go through this really fast because I've taken a little bit longer, because I wasn't sure about what the nature of my audience is. How many of you are economists? How many of you necessarily understand the data in this and the debates around specific things? So it's actually, I've taken longer than I had anticipated. Moving on very quickly, but I think this would interest you. What can the government do? We need a growth strategy for jobs, which involves all 3 sectors. Agrarian investment. India is at a fork in the road. We either continue on the path that we have been on. We continue the MSP price increases and income support through the PM Kisan and subsidies for fertilizer and a whole series of other inputs like electricity, etc. Versus, because all this costs money each of these, you can see this in the budget numbers, versus agri-investment based model to raise productivity. I'm in favor of the latter. Unfortunately, governments for a long time have followed the former. Not a very good way forward. The result is that in India, the growth rate of agriculture has, on average, over a 70-year period, been barely 3.2% per annum. Not good enough, I'm sorry to say, because if you compare this to Southeast Asia, Ashwini Seth argues this. 1950 to 1980, agriculture grew at 6% per annum. Contrast India at 3.2%. China. No, China ensured labor absorption outside of agriculture and pulled workers out of agriculture. But at the same time, point is, number of workers in agriculture fell, and it's actually down to below 30%, while manufacturing is about 25 to 30%. Now, moving on. So clearly, why do we need to invest in agriculture? Public investment. It creates demand for manufacturers. It produces wage goods, which generate themselves non-farm rural jobs. Next, creating jobs for youth. What are the components of an industrial strategy? I'll move through this really fast. This is sort of presenting a summary, but I don't think I have time for the summary. I will, however, ask you to focus on the second point. Unlike East Asian success stories, India has not had an industrial policy since the economic reforms began, meaning a cross-sectoral, horizontal industrial policy has not been in place since 1991. This is no more tenable. India needs a manufacturing strategy which should be cross-sectoral rather than products-based or vertical, which is what the PLI does. It's seen in the government's focus on picking winners. I'll come back to that. The second thing I want you to appreciate is we've allowed in the last 10 years the rupee to appreciate. Yes, hear me out. I'll repeat. Allowed it to appreciate. The real effective exchange rate has appreciated against the dollar. So as I explained to you earlier, our exports have not been competitive. They were competitive for a 25-year period until 2014. You can just have to go to the economic survey of the Ministry of Finance, look at the real effective exchange rate over that period. The index number shows started at 100 in the year 2000, remains at 100 in 2014. It has since then risen. If you see, why is the government imposing tariffs? Because it finds that Indian companies are not being able to export because our rupee has appreciated. You don't have to have tariffs to give Indian companies an advantage. Because if your rupee depreciates rather than appreciates, your exports become cheaper, your imports become more expensive, then you don't need tariffs. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to tell you in 7 slides very rapidly, 7 or 8 slides. What are the components of the strategy? I have a whole paper on this. You may want to read the longish version of it in a book, Cambridge University Press 2020. It's called Planning in the 20th Century and Beyond, that I did with a Swiss scholar, and the subtitle is, that should interest you, India's Planning Commission and the Niti Aayog. And in that, the whole chapter of what the components of this industrial strategy are, it discussed at length. It's also, shorter version is published in the Indian Journal of Labour Economics a few years ago. But let's look at what the government believes it already has, an industrial policy. The PLI, performance-linked incentive, since 2022. What is this seen to be? What you have to understand what it is. It's a fiscal subsidy for production in 14 sectors. Well, incentives will be disbursed. The scheme says only after production has taken place in the country, linking incentives to output. The calculation of incentives will be, the incentive is about 5 to 6% of sales. Sales value will be based on incremental production to be achieved at a high rate of growth. Okay, unquote. It provides on average 5% of production value as incentive. It was announced in 2020. And in the budget for 21-22, it was announced that the 14 sectors will receive over a 5-year period $26 billion, nearly 2 lakh crores. That's nearly 40,000 crores subsidy for these large companies which will produce. What are the issues? One issue. You see, East Asia was a success story in respect of industrial policy. They manufactured and they manufactured for export, but they did not pick winning firms. PLI is saying we will pick winning firms rather than sectors. This is makes the PLI thing opposite of East Asia. Moving on. It is giving the bureaucracy a role in picking winners. This unfortunately harks back to the license permit route. Not a very clever idea. Thirdly, for the PLI, we've chosen 12 of, mostly capital intensive. 12 of the 14 sectors are capital intensive. How many jobs will they create? When it's claimed that jobs are going to be created. In the next slide, I'll briefly look at what has happened with Samsung and Apple, how many jobs they've created. In addition, there is a significant fiscal cost of the PLI. When funds are needed for human capital, for vocational education, for skills, for higher education, for R&D, and we're not spending on that. We are subsidizing foreign firms and large domestic firms. Is that a very clever move? And then fifth, government is risking demand for the extension of benefits because the scheme is for 5 years. This often happens. The employers, as capitalists, always want extension of all the subsidies. And really, problem is, there's no expectation of these winning firms that will win the PLI are to export. Some they were exporting, but it's not a requirement. This is the opposite of what was required in the East Asian case, which is how the East Asian economies became such manufacturing export powerhouses. Does the ELI, the recent budget 24 ones, solve the problem? Not really. Yes, it's true on account of the earlier version of PLI, the mobile phones have benefited. I can discuss this, but in the interest of time, I won't, because we've got too little time. I want to really move on to the other. What we need is an industrial policy is needed for jobs to grow. And a major problem has been that in the last 30 plus years since 1991 economic reforms began, we haven't had an explicit industrial policy. All we've had is the 1991 industrial policy statement. For the first time, when I was in the Planning Commission, heading the Development Policy Division, we were writing the 12th five-year plan. Arun Maira was the industry member for Planning Commission, and I was involved in the 11th five-year plan drafting. I was involved in the 12th five-year as well, jobs, skills chapters, as well as the industry chapter. And for the first time in a very long time, in 2012, in the 12th plan, you see mention of industrial policy. Unfortunately, after 2012, the government went into policy paralysis and we never saw the actual implementation. But what's the problem? I think you need to all appreciate. Let me explain. Because you need to understand this in historical context. What's the problem with our manufacturing? Unlike East Asia, we have lacked a manufacturing policy for 25 years since 1991. What are the dimensions here? Since 1991, we rightly reduced tariff from 150% in 1990, the average, to 40% in 1998, to 10% in 2002. But there were three types of problems with this reduction of tariffs from an excessively high, unnecessarily excessively high level within 10 or 12 years, down from 150 to 10%. One was the speed. It was too fast. And it fell below the WTO upper bound rates. There was no need to do that. The Chinese didn't do that. And this affected the small and and large manufacturers very adversely because we had built up a significant, SME sector by then, by 1990. So speed was too fast of tariff reduction. Next, the sequence of policy was wrong of tariffs reduction. What do I mean? We used to, since the 1956 Industrial Policy Resolution, had gradually increased the number of products which were reserved, where the products were reserved to be produced by small-scale industries alone. The number had shot up to 836 products by 1991. The reduction of these SSI reservations of products begins after 1991, but it takes 15 years for them to reduce 836 to 500 by 2005. Can you imagine? It took 15 years after the economic reforms. In 2005, there were still 500 products. What was the mistake in the sequence here? Without ending reservation of products for SSI, reservation meant that large firms in India could not compete with the small firms. But what did we do? Reducing tariffs, we permitted international competition first instead of permitting and encouraging domestic competition to emerge first. The result was deindustrialization on a significant scale happening. The third problem with this tariff reduction was the structure of tariffs, which began especially post the free trade agreements that we signed, first with Korea, then with Japan, then with the ASEAN. What is the problem? It's called the inverted duty structure problem, which unfortunately still survives. What's the IDS? The IDS means that the finished and consumer goods tariffs are reduced, so imports flooded in, and that problem still survives. Why do you think we are still importing Chinese products on a massive scale? But tariffs on raw materials, intermediate inputs, which would be used for domestic manufacture, they were higher than the tariffs for consumer goods or for finished goods. This is called an inverted duty structure, and this reduces the effective rate of production. What you need are relatively, tariffs which don't create this IDS phenomenon, because this phenomenon it resulted in imported finished goods flooding and further deindustrialization. So three problems: speed, sequence, and structure of tariffs with the reduction, and little focus on labor manufacturing. So what we need to reverse the aborted structural transformation, which I've been referring to, because manufacturing is a contribution to GVA. I noticed that I missed out a slide here in the interest of time, which says that something that hadn't happened till 2014 for 25 years, the share of manufacturing in GVA in India, which had been consistent for 17 years, that fell to 13% in the next 5 years. It has since actually climbed just a little bit. It's still not reached the 17%. Can you imagine? And I'm talking about the 23-24. It's still only 15% of GVA. That means you add workers in agriculture, you reduce manufacturing. And I somehow didn't manage to say this. Manufacturing employment fell after 2012 in absolute terms, especially in labor-intensive sectors, a subject I'll come to in a minute. So the first thing we have to do in a coherent manufacturing policy is to correct the inverted duty structure, and especially with China. So we have to product by product examine the effective rates of protection. I mean, tariff changes since 2014 in electronics have improved domestic electronics manufacturing, which I was hinting at, but components are still all imported. Not much use, which is why as I said, manufacturing contribution to GVA has actually fallen post 2016. Effective rates of protection analysis shows that the inverted duty structure exists for paper, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, computers, electronics, optical products, machinery, equipment, other
Professor
Santosh
Santosh.
About this in 2012.
Professor Santosh.
If this was corrected, it will help
Professor,
incentives
yeah.
for investing.
Professor Santosh, you have
Okay.
taken about
Yes, please.
65 minutes. So
Yeah,
can you please
very
wrap up?
rapidly, sir. Very rapidly, I'm moving. I will move really rapidly. Now, very important here in this regard, the auto sector has no ideas. And the auto sector also has a manufacturing plan from 2006 to 16, which has been extended to 26. And you can see India has become, as a result, the second, third, or fourth largest producer of two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, and exporting trucks and cars. Pharmaceuticals, same story. Moving on. So clearly, policy implication of ideas, you may raise tariffs a little bit, but raising tariffs alone will not transform manufacturing. You have to use anti-dumping measures, but this must be part of a strategy, including the real effective exchange rate, which, as I said, has been appreciating. Next, just focus government policy a bit on the unorganized sector. The scale of enterprise informality is very high. I have here captured look at in the last column, and the share of enterprises, total organized, total unorganized. Look at the dark blue row in the year 2015. That's at the bottom. The total organized is, believe it or not, 96.7. Organized, this is all non-farm, is barely 3.3. And within the unorganized, now just I'm asking you to go back up, unorganized manufacturing, services, and construction, first column, of them only 30% are registered. 70% or 67.7% are not even registered. So the government doesn't even know. That means there's a blind spot in policy. That's how massive the scale of enterprise informality, and hence the focus needs on MSME. Second element, and there are only seven elements, Dr. Chand Singh, so I'm really finishing. We need special packages for labor-intensive industries to create jobs. This is consistent with the idea that we can have some sectoral or vertical approaches. What are the 5 labor-intensive sectors? 5. Apparel, textiles, food processing, wood manufacturers, leather, footwear. These account for 50% of total manufacturing jobs in India. There is, of course, potential for increasing exports here, but there is also growing, domestic demand. And 2004 to 12 saw rising domestic demand, and because non-farm jobs were rising, it was raising consumption on these simple manufacturers. That's why I'm asking you to recall the 7.5 million jobs per annum that we were creating. Why? Because of the emerging labor-intensive industries, these 5 sectors. I'm going to move on. And because if we have a new package for these 5, it will help the SMEs in these sectors. It will encourage scale economies like Vietnam and Bangladesh are achieving. And this would counter the World Bank WDR 24 critique that Indian firms don't grow. Well, if you don't provide them with the kind of support they need, they're not going to grow. And I will come to how that is going to be provided. What the focus has been on national champions, because that's a stated policy goal. What is the national champions? Well, it has resulted, as Viral Acharya has shown in an excellent paper based on ASI data, concentration of 5 largest corporates at the expense of the next 5, and so on. As a result, wealth and income inequality has increased. Next, supportive of the previous point, that means focus on MSMEs, we have a strategy of cluster development. This is a strategy to support them with production linkages with larger units. This is an established strategy of late industrializers like China and of northern Italy. India has been a laggard in this regard. Please understand, and it's very important that you do, that there are 5,500 organic clusters that exist in our country, across the whole country. 1450 are modern, then there are handloom, handicraft, and other traditional products. What's the problem with our cluster development strategy? It needs to raise productivity, quality, and scale. There's 3 problems. Finance is very poorly funded. For 5,500 clusters, barely 1,000 crores. Then, what are the input services they need? There's no integration at the cluster level of services being provided in terms of credit, technology, skills, and market development. Then there is policy coherence issues. Don't have time to go into it. I mean, just to give you a feel for how much can be achieved. China manufactures socks in 100 clusters across China. We can, of course, induce new clusters along 5 industry infrastructure corridors along the Golden Quadrilateral, but we have to encourage the 5,000 organic clusters, which are older clusters. Moving on. 4th point out of 7. Let me assure you, Dr. Charan Singh, just 3 or 4 more slides. We need to support growth and infrastructure in mid-sized towns which have very poor infrastructure, which is where the clusters are located. Therefore, Amrut, our 500 cities program, Amrut, we need to align urban infrastructure development with manufacturing clusters to create jobs. I don't have the time to develop this. Next, human resources, absolutely critical. East Asian countries, particularly China, have written extensively on this subject. Education, Tibet, designed to underpin industrial policy and industrial policy for jobs for girls. Because if you have, cluster-driven skilling taking place on a large scale, the girls will not have to go very far and they will get the jobs right there. The industries are there. You will be able to encourage industries to join and participate in the skilling program. I'm moving on very rapidly. But the state of India's human capital is really appalling, as this will show, but I can't talk about this. And I've written extensively on this subject. You can Google me on this. I'm going to move on. And this is my last slide. These are just 2 more components of India's manufacturing strategy which we need to adopt. Industrial corridors to engage in global value chains and meet export and domestic demand from manufacturers. We have in the works 5 industrial corridors being built, DMIC with 8 nodes, Amritsar, Kolkata is another, but there are remaining 3 which are planned in the south, and those need more central government financing, in addition to perhaps World Bank and ADB financing. I'm going to move on. Finally, this is my last point, that we cannot possibly have manufacturing strategy without having a design and national innovation system. The industrial policy needs a design ecosystem, and that's the only thing that will work. Design labs work to design quality products, carry out digitization, connect electronic systems, innovate for automation, all of which are needed if India is to adapt and develop industrial technology for. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for going on longer than I intended. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Santosh. Longish, but I thought it was very, very good. Let's keep on. Let's keep moving. And let's move to Kingshuk, Professor Kingshuk Sarkar. Over to you now.
I think we're seriously running out of. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, Kingshuk, I've taken longer than I had intended.
Thank you, Professor Charan Singh, for having me here for this webinar as a discussion. I have a presentation. I understand that we are very pressed for time. So now I'll be briefly go about the what I want to say regarding.
Professor Kingshuk, do you have a PPT?
I have a PPT. I'm sharing screen. Give me a minute.
Please do that.
So, is the PPT visible? Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
I make it full screen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Just a minute. I should start the slideshow. Is it visible, sir?
Yep, yes.
So I think Professor Mehrotra has very elaborately discussed the facts and figures. So I will complement whatever already has been said in the webinar. So I add on to that, like fully in agreement and what has been already been said. So I'll focus on a few certain things. Like one is the uh, like jobs have been created to a certain extent. The numbers have been discussed just now, but the question is that the kind of quality of those jobs, and like because those jobs are mostly in the informal sector, and also the quality of job is very poor, and a very significant percent of the job that has been created are actually falls under the self-employment category. So post-COVID, many workers have returned to agriculture also. So we have a reversal of structural occupational transformation that our country witnessed during 2009 to 12, that absolute number of people in agriculture failed. But after that, the trend could not be sustained, and last 3-4 years, particularly after COVID, we are seeing a reversal back to agriculture, which is not at all very desired kind of a development. And so we now have, what we have now is the outcome. The outcome of this is a working poor phenomenon. Working poor means you do job, you do something, mostly in the, like you do something on your own, particularly some petty economic activities that you do, or even now that UFL, unpaid family labor thing that you do, but you still remain poor. So the thing is that employment will make you come out of the poverty might not be true anymore. And also the way employment is being measured in India, that is nothing to do with the return on employment. It means how much you are earning, how much is the wages or salaries. Nothing like, if you, whatever category, whatever definition of employment that you employ, whether it is say current weekly status or usual status, it doesn't take into account any like return on employment. And also very our it is hard for the poor people, like if you the rural unemployment rate is low because poor people can hardly afford to remain unemployed. They need to do something or the other, otherwise the other option is starving, so they do something. But if you look at the that all the slides that Professor Mehrotra has shown, that all the real wages and the wages conditions that are becoming worse over time. So, and if this is broadly the labor market characteristics of India today, the declining output elasticity of employment generation. So, labor productivity is going up, but employment elasticity is going down. There is increasing informalization that is happening. Weak structural transformation. Now we can say it is a reversal of structural transformation. Then we have to deal with declining female labor force participation rate. There has been talk about that female labor force participation jumped from 25% to 37% last 4 years, but it is mostly in UFL and agriculture, which is, I don't think that is a good thing to happen. And then there is a skill education mismatch also. And so labor market suffers from structural problems, and there is high open unemployment among the educated urban youth that is also there. So this broadly, this is the labor market characteristics, that labor market we are having in India today. And if we look at the quality of employment and jobs, so you see that majority of India's labor force, like 57%, this is all the figures are PLF's data. All the figures that I've collected are PLF's data of the last, starting 2016 to, I could not include the latest one, but up to 22-23. So the 57% of the workers in the informal sector are self-employed, and that number has gone up since 2021. This number. So if you look within that, the male self-employed, they earn about 15,000 rupees per month. Females earn about 5,000 rupees. So there is a huge gap even within the self-employed male and female. It's a huge gender gap between them. And if you look between July 22 and June 23, the average earnings for the self-employed dropped by 3%, reflecting increased distress, largely due to the rising share of low-paid female workers. So when you have more female workers joining the group of self-employed people, the earning under the self-employment options go down because females are paid almost 1/3 of all males are paid. Then you have casual workers. Casual workers, they make up 23% of the labor force. Casual workers, as of June 23, male casual workers earning was 432 per day and females earn 291 per day. From July 22 to June 23, their earnings again fell by 3%. Casual workers lack job security, are not covered by any labor laws, and no access to institutional social security. Then you have regular workers. Now, regular workers constitute only 20% of the labor force, but regular workers doesn't mean that they have a job contract as such. 62% have 62% within the even regular workers don't have a written job contract. 51% are without paid leave. 60% are without social security. Also, ASI data shows that share of contract workers in organized manufacturing increased from 23% in 2002-03 to 40% in 2021-22. This indicates that regular employment is not rising, largely due to declining labor use in the organized manufacturing sector. And relative share of regular workers also very low if you compare it on international scale. India's share of regular worker is only 23%. Suppose if we compare with the other comparable countries like Brazil, the share is 68%. China, it is 54%. Even in Bangladesh, it is 42%. So rise, and also last 1 decade or so, even Niti Aayog concept paper on gig and platform workers show that there is a significant rise in the number of gig and platform workers. Those numbers might also be shown as increase in employment. Obviously, this is increase in employment, but the quality of employment in gig and platform workers is still a very big question, because gig and platform workers are only included as unorganized sector workers under the Social Security Code 2020. Other labor laws don't mention gig and platform workers. Gig workers, they are encouraged to register in the EGROW portal. However, the gig workers number is said to go up many folds, like in the coming 10 years. That Niti Aayog report also kind of showed like that projection for gig and platform workers to go almost 3 to 4 times what we have now, around 3 crores gig worker. So this is going to go up further. So the key issue in India is, I think, it's a structural issue in the sense that like our occupational distribution could not keep pace with the national sectoral distribution of national income. So as you know that like even last year it was 42% of the income was of the labor force was engaged in agriculture in primary sector, whereas primary sector contribution to the national income is around 14%, and that has gone down to 13%. But last year also it has, like if you compare the two years, the agriculture's livelihood engagement has gone up from 42% to 46%. So it is jumped more than 45%. So like agriculture is having more than 3 times workers that it should be having. So that workers are not getting absorbed in the organized manufacturing sector. They are getting absorbed to a certain extent in the service sector, but only as unorganized workers or as self-employed in the urban fringe economy. So the thing is that we need to, like the delusion model, like that dual economic model, that there is surplus labor from agriculture to be productively employed in the manufacturing sector. India, I think at best could have partially enjoyed that, but the rest of it is not happening at all. So I think we have to somehow we have to address this issue of structural, this structural problem has to be tackled. Otherwise, employment situation is not going to go up. And if we look at the, I will spend 1 or 2 minutes on the issue of employment and labor reform, because many times it has been told that there are labor laws which is preventing more employment to happen. Particularly, people keep on referring to Section 5B of the Industrial Dispute Act 1947. But not only this, there are other labor laws also which give some protection to the workers. But if you look at it, there is no facts and figures to support this contention. And I'm like looking at it very dispassionately and very, I would say, without any kind of from neutral point of view. Because what I have seen, even as a when I worked as a labor administrator, is that even those like this threshold of 100 workers, now in the labor code it is 300 workers, but most of the registered companies, registered manufacturing sectors has much more higher labor as regular workers there. But over the years, if you look the last 3 decades, they have kept on increasing, like more contract workers, more casual workers. So it's not that you cross 100, then you don't do that. So it's equally true for people. If organization above 100 or below 100. So I think the question is much more economic rather than, and they have found different ways of like giving different nomenclature to the labor, like contract labor, then casual labor, then we have fixed term employment, then we have cash labor. So there are different nomenclatures been given. Outsourcing happened. You enter any private sector bank, you see 50 people working inside, but only 9 is shown as employees of that bank. Rest all are outsourced. So all these things have been done to kind of, but this is not because they want to just avoid the implication of Industrial Dispute Act or EPF Act or ESI Act, which is partially true, yes, but not only that, because at the end of the day, labor is only one area. They are kind of reducing the cost. So in the pursuit of maximization of profit, the area where they, because in other markets like land market, like capital market, in all other like power sector, power that they buy, they are all non-negotiable. Only negotiable factor you have is labor. So every focus, like increasing profit is coming through by at the expense of the labor. So that's economic issue. It's not a labor law being there. That is because if you look at, suppose one example I give, construction industry last 30 years, it has been one of the highest employment giver as far as share of construction in employment goes. But employment is carried out all by kind of ASI registered companies or organized sector companies. They all have unorganized labor. 100% unorganized labor are there in the construction industry. So you cannot give the excuse that labor laws are preventing you from, like, if employment is going to happen, it is going to happen. So it's not the labor law that is preventing that. So also, if you look at the developed countries, developed capitalist countries, that West European countries, France, Germany, Italy, US, they have much more stringent labor laws. In face of those labor laws, like section chapter 5B of Industrial Dispute Act, you will see more innocuous or more innocent kind of a chapter, I would say. So I think that entire logic, I think doesn't hold good here at all. So like I now spend last few minutes because I know I need to finish. I did this is a work I did for EGROW Foundation only. So Professor Charan Singh delegated this work to me, so which was later on submitted to Niti Aayog. Just quoting from that work. This is part of one study. So I think this is the kind of a realistic projection that we could do from 2047-48 is the vision 47 kind of a thing. So primary sector will be contributing occupational wise 25%, secondary 24%, and tertiary 51%. And if projected labor force participation rate would be somewhere in 52.5%, and if that happens, so we will be having this is the Lancet study. I took it from the Lancet study. So India's population, age group, and the demographic dividend that we are discussing, so that will be peaking around another 15 years, and then it will get diffused. I'm going further. Projection for 2047 is that projected population of India in 2047 would be 1629096,126, and population above 15 years would be 138 million. And out of this, the projected elect year is 52.5%. So Indian labor force would be 72 crores labor force, or 726 million labor force, size of the labor force. Present size is 501 million. So we will be having an addition of 225 million people in next 25 years or so. So I tried to have, like, based on the employment elasticity and capital investment that might happen, these are the sectors that I could kind of identify where potential employment generations is possible. So there is a breakup of how these 225 million new employment that we need to generate in the next 25 years are divided. So so we have this manufacturing. These are the sectors: textile, automobile, leather, defense, pharmaceutical, electronics. These are the sector under manufacturing. Then non-farm manufacturing, construction, agro industries, public infrastructure, and these are the divisions. And like you have services also. I think health and tourism, transport, logistics, IT. These are the classifications under services. And you have banking and insurance that will also contribute, real estate, renting and business activities, hotels and restaurants. Then education can play, if we spend more on education, then employment in education and public health. These are the two things that are very crucial, not talked about that much. Then we have potential of generating 17.5 and 12.5 new millions new employment in the next 25 years. So altogether, this slides is kind of, this slides is like a breakup of what can we do, like given the kind of capital investment, the investment projections, and the employment elasticity is calculated on present figure. So this is a projection that we did, that 225 million new employment that we need, how that 225 million can come from different sectors, that is given. So I think, thanks for your kind attention. I stop here. Thank you.
We are almost 2 hours there. And I think the presentation and the discussion has been very rich. Though it has taken us some time, but I think the presentation by both of you has been very good. I thought, Kingshuk, you clarified many things, and I want to thank you for clarifying those issues. And of course, Professor Santosh, you have gone from the basics to the very, very difficult issues. Your own experience in the Planning Commission and policy was so apparent. Now, if everybody agrees, we had at one point about 70 participants. I know it's a puja day. We are down to 52. You could take a question in the chat box, Professor Mehrotra, and
I
then
would like to ask, Charan.
yeah, Professor Ashok Vishandas can ask the first question. Then Professor Mehrotra, you can look at the questions in the chat box, and maybe 2-3 minutes, 5 minutes you can take for that. Same thing for you, Professor Kingshuk. In the chat box, there are a couple of questions. If you want to tackle any one of them or address them, I'll be happy. But I think we should wrap up by 6:30 sharp.
Yes.
Because it's a puja day and everybody has to go for puja, including me. So we should wrap up by 6:30 sharp. So I'll start with Professor Vishandas, then go over to Professor Mehrotra, and then go over to Professor Kingshuk.
Thank you, Professor Charan, and I must congratulate both the panelists, Professor Santosh and Professor Sarkar, for giving masterful exposition. It was very enriching. My straightway very brief question to Professor Santosh. You talked about the India's fork in the road. That means subsidy versus investment. Now, MSP, just an example. I'm relating it because I was chairman of CACP, who fixes the minimum support price. And the question is, economic reasoning, you say, because there are many commodity in the agriculture, fisheries, say milk, just 2 examples, which has no subsidy, no MSP, but their growth rate is much higher than the crop husbandry. So the point is established on economic reasoning. But the question is, the dilemma before the government is, doesn't matter which philosophy the government has, it cannot do away with the MSP because of the political compulsion and competing offered by the competing political parties. So at least I don't anticipate in my lifetime that MSP will vanish. So that's the reality. Now, in that kind of scenario, what are the options? That is question one. Second is about the labor. You talked about so many things about the labor employment, but not the labor productivity. Just to give an illustration, that 15% of agri GVA each contributed by about 46% of workforce, compared to 85% GVA by non-agriculture, which is contributed by remaining 54%. If we adjust these data, that shows that productivity of agriculture is just 21% compared to non-agriculture sector. I mean, I can't imagine that, and no wonder that the farm level income is much lower compared to non-farm income. So that is the one. These data will illustrate why farmers are in a very distressful condition, no doubt. Now, how to withdraw the excess labor force from agriculture? I did some study way back in 2015, where some agriculture labor was trained for about 3 weeks, just 3 weeks, and they're in the diamond polishing in Gujarat, and their labor wage become from 250 to around 1200. That means 4 to 5 times. Now, such measures can be implemented. So, what is your take on these points?
Very good. Dr. Charan Singh, I'll quickly answer the former CSCP chairman's questions. But if you don't mind, I'll request you to actually read out or filter for me the chats, because I'm not that familiar with WebEx. But so let me.
I'll do that. I will.
So let me respond to Professor. You make valid points, sir. So let me just very briefly respond. On the MSP, I agree with you. Don't think I was saying you can do away with it. On the contrary, I would suggest that what we need to do, that we cannot have a situation continuing as it has for the last 20, maybe, I don't know, half a century practically. We've had the MSP, that we have an MSP for only 3 products. What is the case? The case is that, the case that is being made, let's have an MSP on which there's no need to be for government procurement. The case is for 23 products having a government announcing an MSP. The idea is not that the government will procure for these products. The government will intervene if and only if the price falls below a certain level, a threshold. And in that situation, sir, what would happen is that Punjabi farmers who are unnecessarily bringing the water table down, overusing surface water, they'll be willing to shift out because if there is a minimum threshold announced by announcement of an MSP, then only when the price drops below that level will the government intervene. So this, there is a bogey around MSP, legal MSP guarantee for 23 products that, government cannot spend 10 lakh crores. Who's saying government has to spend 10 lakh crores? No one is saying that. All those people, the farmers who are asking for legal MSP, that's point one. We have to bring farmers out of this focus on rice and wheat, which is, so no one suggesting MSP. Second point in this connection. Sir, may I request everyone to mute themselves? Second point, we are not just using MSP. Can everyone mute themselves, please? Liner. No, your mic is on, ma'am. Sir, your mic is on. Vivek, can you mute everyone, please? Otherwise, I can't answer. Okay. Next point, sir. The point I'm making, sir, in is that why do we have a Kisan support meant only for cultivators? It excludes tenant farmers. It's only for owner cultivators. Secondly, it excludes landless labor. Now, these are the poorest people. You are And the cash transfer is not available to urban poor. We have to correct for this. I have a whole paper on this, so we'll have to have a separate conversation with it. On the labor productivity, 100% agreed. I discussed it, but very passingly, that 15% of gross value added coming from 46% of the workforce in agriculture. I said that, maybe I said it so fast. The point here is, how are you going to improve that situation? You have to pull workers out of agriculture, and the only way you're going to do it is not by expanding more modern services, because farmers can't do that. You need more construction investment in urban housing and low-cost urban housing, not for housing for Charan Singh and Professor Das and myself. The third point, you're absolutely right on how to reduce agricultural employment. You see, the young are getting educated. Girls are getting educated. Again, I had limited time in the skills part, which was I think the fifth component of my manufacturing strategy. I was saying, you need skilling for people at the cluster level. Don't skill people in Lucknow or in Patna. There are clusters in Muradabad, in Firozabad. Skill people there and engage the BMOs, meaning the business management organization. Honestly, in the interest of time, I'll stop there so that Professor Charan, you can carry on and ask the chat questions.
Yeah, I'll ask you one question.
G.
It is from Devesh. If possible, please discuss the percentage of unemployment with regard to the data as shared by ILO a few months back, which stated that 83% of youth population is unemployed.
No, I've understood the question. I'll respond very, very, very quickly.
Yeah.
This is a misreading of the data by you, sir, whoever is asking the question. Let me explain. The statement in the Institute of Human Development ILO report is the following. Please, if you can download it, and I'll tell you what it's saying. Of all unemployed, 83% are youth. Of all unemployed, 83% are youth. I'm repeating it for your benefit. What am I saying? I showed you in the youth unemployment that youth unemployment has shot up. It had tripled first until 2017-18. It has slightly come down. It has come down, but that's misleading. It's come down because these young, after having gotten educated, to save face when the PLFS enumerator comes to their door and asks them, "Kya karte ho beta?" So the young man says, "Kheti karta hu." So he shows up in agriculture. Actually, he's doing nothing, but he's showing up in agriculture. He's practically unpaid family labor, and the women and the girls are joining them. You see, this is what I am suggesting, that youth unemployment has shot up, and they don't want to be either unemployed or to be not in education, employment, or training. They want to work. The girls want to work. I'll tell you now about the girls. Let me give you. Nandi Foundation did a survey in 2017 across 20 states of 70,000 teenage girls, 13 to 19. What is the question? The answer stuck in my memory. One, the girls were asked, "What age do you want to get married?" Please remember that for girls, marriage legal age is 18. 25% of them said between 18 and 20. 51% said between 20 and 25. What does that mean? It means that I've got educated. I don't want to get married. I want to work, which is why I'm saying skill them a little bit, get them into the clusters. The clusters are 5,500 spread across the country in small towns. Build the right infrastructure there, skill them there. Tell National Skill Development Corporation to work with the business management organizations in that cluster. And you will get phenomenal results, I guarantee you. Let me stop there. Next.
Yeah, Professor, that's the important one. And I totally agree with your assessment, because at IIM Bangalore, when I was doing surveys on inflation, people were ready to go and tolerate inflation double digit, but they said even the girls want to get married and they'll get married at the right place if they have the right job.
Correct.
And if you have to go up in your career, in your life, in your social status, you have to have a job, and this job will help you go up in your social status
Correct.
also
So,
and get married in a family
जी
which will take you further.
और
I
ये
have
लड़की बेचारियां
in
बेचारी कह रही हैं कि हम शादी नहीं करना चाहते मगर वो कर क्या रही हैं कर अनपेड फैमिली लेबर बनी जा रही हैं दे आर शोइंग देमसेल्व्स इन एग्रीकल्चर सॉरी
in the EGROW webinar series, we had interviewed one female worker who was a housemaid, and her husband was a dhobi, and her daughter was a educated young lady working in a bank. And at that time, the housemaid mentioned that she is in a problem because now that her daughter is educated, she doesn't want to get married in the strata in which she belongs. And in the strata where the daughter is working, they don't want to get married to her because she is not finding a right match for
Correct.
various reasons.
Yes,
Long
yes.
story short, I'm happy to tell you that that housemaid found for her daughter a husband which satisfies the criteria that the daughter required. And that happened because the daughter was working,
Yes.
but the marriage got delayed by 2 or 3 years, right?
Of course.
So I would agree with your assessment of that survey that more and more women, and this is an illustration
Yes.
that as you get educated, your expectations go up, you want to move up the social ladder,
It's
and
a-
marriage can wait. I am bringing in the point that the society in the country is changing. Employment is gathering paramount importance for social movement, right? Okay.
Totally.
And now let me move on just because after a very interesting discussion, but time is racing against us. Professor Kingshuk, would you like
Yes,
to
I have
take-
I think one observation by Devesh that he said that that labor laws might not impact employment generation, but the quality of employment can be impacted because many people can be outside the how the labor reforms is being done and the way the labor enforcement is happening. Many people might be outside the protection that is actually provided under the labor laws. I fully agree with this. The point is that some people say, like many economists and many policy makers, they say that labor law, they believe that in their code. To that labor laws are there. That is why employment generation is suffering. My point here is that it is not absolutely not true. Labor law is not preventing employment generation as such because the employers have lot of other ways to bypass the labor laws and have their employment. So if you want to employ 100 people, you will find a way of employing 100 people. So you cannot say that I would have employed 150 people had labor laws being not there. You employ as per your your production function, but employed not as regular worker because no labor law initially or even now have this classification of regular workers, contract workers. So this classification came much later. The Contract Labor Act of 1970 was an act to perpetuate contract worker because at that time, because of nationalization, lot of contract laborers were there and the Supreme Court actually regularized their work. For prevention of those regularization, Contract Labor Act was brought. So it's not that actually Contract Labor Act 1970 actually facilitates employment of contract labor. So that this entire this talk debate about is true, and I agree with the proposition that without even labor laws being getting diluted or many people are getting excluded in the process, the quality of employment and conditions of work, you find if you open newspaper every day, you find people dying out of accident because occupational laws are not applicable for small factories and small units. When people die, that nobody cares about it. So that's something different. But the proposition that employment is getting hampered, I don't think that is a right thing. So I end here. So that is what is being kind of that the question that referred to me. So
Sure. I think time to conclude now. We have exceeded to our limit. Just making two major announcements. One, this excellent discussion, which I'm sure each one of us is going to listen to it again. We will put it on our website tomorrow by noon. Fantastic discussion, very informative. If Professor, both of you will agree, because both of your PowerPoints are also very powerful, we'll put them on the, along with the discussion, we'll put them on the recording, if you will agree. If you think you do not want to, we will
No,
not.
it's okay, no problem.
We can put your PowerPoint along with
Yes,
the.
yes, no problem. I can share my PowerPoint. I can mail my PowerPoint.
So because these are so informative and so excellent presentations, and the time was so short that each one of you had to rush through. So, and then if people are interested.
I really rushed through. I took only 12 minutes. to
Yeah,
finish.
you rushed, and actually, Professor Santosh also rushed at the end when, he had spent 45 minutes on 11 slides, and then he also rushed very rapidly. So that's why I'm saying the PowerPoint will help everybody understand it deeper. Okay, so first thing, the presentations will be available tomorrow on our website. The second is next week on 15th of October, we have the chief economist from NABARD, former ED from RBI, Mr. Srikant Patnaik, speaking to us on the state of the rural economy. You will love it. It's a survey-based study also which he'll be presenting, and I think it will be very, very informative. Please join. The timing will be the same. It will be on the website. We'll tell you the time, 4 to 5:30. Next Friday, which is our favorite slot, we have Dr. Surjit Bhalla speak to us on female labor force participation, some of the issues which Professor Santosh in his discussion mentioned today. So I'd like to welcome you also for the presentation by Dr. Surjit Bhalla. With that, let me once again thank the speaker, thank the discussant, thank the participants for being with us, participating with us on the special Durga Puja day. We are talking about this issue and staying with us through the length of the discussion. Thank you very much.